Well, we made it, folks. The end of Futurama's first season on Hulu. Their first season in 10 entire years. And did they close out their return season with a bang? Personally, yeah, I think they did. The season finale, titled All the Way Down, delivers the one truly sci-fi focused episode of the season with an inspired look at simulation theory. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Not just for some top-notch science fiction, but for what I think is some really impressive subtext as well. So, let's wrap out our coverage of Futurama's new season and dive all the way down. This week's episode of Johnny Two Cellos is brought to you by Cartoons That Curse, the podcast about adult animation starring Johnny Two Cellos and Toonrific Tariq. They've covered nearly the entirety of Futurama so far, and have been mostly keeping up with the newest season as well, episode by episode, so go check it out. Subscribe. Futurama's finale basically cuts right to the chase, immediately introducing a pixelated, low-res version of Planet Express, and revealing that the professor has created a simulation of the entire universe. Love when an episode just immediately dives into its central premise, especially because there's a lot to mine out of simulation theory here. This is the first episode penned by the show's co-creator David X. Cohen since Free Will Hunting in 2012, and honestly, this is my favorite Futurama script from Cohen since the original run. But like Free Will Hunting, it tackles incredibly existential themes, this time not only through Bender, but through the rest of the crew and the simulated versions of the crew. The title of the episode is derived from an old expression that alludes to the problem of infinite regress. The phrase stems from the concept of the world turtle, the one that holds the flat earth on its back in mythology. The question is, if the world is on a turtle, what is the turtle on? Well, it's on a larger turtle, of course, and what's under that turtle? Well, it's turtles all the way down. Hence this episode's simulation in a simulation in a simulation. The episode has a little bit in common with the Rick and Morty episode The Ricks Must Be Crazy, where Rick creates a micro-universe to power his car battery, in that it's got a universe in a universe in a universe. An existential story in itself, however, with these universes being simulated, it's definitely a bit more focused on that simulation theory in general. But it is funny, Rick and Morty started airing about 3 months after Futurama's last finale, meanwhile, and so they have basically aired their entire 61 episode run in the shadow of Futurama, attempting to tackle sci-fi stories in ways that Futurama hadn't. Now, with Futurama's return, they have to avoid covering sci-fi ideas too similarly to Rick and Morty. Honestly, this only has a few similarities to the Microverse episode, and Rick and Morty actually won an Emmy for their riff on the time button from Meanwhile, which they directly call out as being a concept from Futurama.
A device that lets you
save your place like in a video game, but in real life so that you can try stuff and then go back to your save point. Yes, Morty, I saw it on Futurama.
Even though it was in simulated form, I really loved Fry and Leela's little date in Space Italy. It is pretty funny that despite last week's episode, every other story this season has made a point to highlight that Fry and Leela are a couple and that they're doing really well together.
I just can't understand how it doesn't fall down.
Let me give you a hand.
Honestly, I think what I loved most about this episode is that it really did make me think more about simulation theory. I've never really looked into it seriously before, but they did such a great job breaking it down into concepts that anyone can understand through the dialogue and character interactions. Basically, the professor explains that there are limitations of his universe simulation due to the limitations of his computer's processing abilities.
So I had to have the information travel outward gradually at a fixed speed.
Like the speed of light in our universe?
Right.
I also appreciate that the one really pressing the professor on these ideas is Amy. It feels like only a handful of episodes really embrace her scientific side, and she did get her doctorate back in the episode That Darn Cats.
So your programming shortcut is like quantum mechanics in our world?
Exactly like that.
I also think it was genius for them to further explore the simulated universe through Bender's eyes, a character who is constantly going through his own existential crises. After Amy calls him artificial intelligence, he not only goes through another one of these crises, but starts intensely relating to the simulated versions of the characters. Through his own existential baggage, he empathizes with them and tries to protect their universe at all costs.
They deserve the same respect as any other living creature.
This leads to the professor using a sewage-fueled hydroelectric dam to properly power the simulation, allowing it to continue running and increasing its resolution, which leads to the next major development, and really what the entire episode is built around. That simulation of the universe then develops its own simulation of the universe.
Sweet facsimile of Space Italy. A simulation? Within a simulation?
The progression of the simulation stories escalate pretty perfectly. We basically see them catch up to the current episode's story. There's even a little low-res sequence of the simulation playing out the events of this season's premiere before that. So the simulation catching up to this episode means that they then start to question whether or not they might be in a simulation, just like Amy did before. But now, with our crew observing the simulated crew, they know the answer to their question for certain.
I mean, what if our laws of physics are just the computer code of some big, brilliant professor playing God up there?
Nailed it.
So for the simulated characters, in order to figure out if they're living in a simulation, they decide to force the collapse of a magnetic star, something so complex that the computer won't be able to properly simulate it without glitching out, which the non-simulated professor realizes will, without question, show them that they are in a simulation. And Bender's existential empathy overload leads him to want to be the one to tell his computerized compatriots that they aren't real. He wants to be there for them in that really difficult time. The professor hooks him into the simulation, but before Bender can tell everyone, Fry's impassioned speech about what they mean to each other brings Bender peace.
It doesn't matter if I'm real?
So what did you want to tell us, Robert?
Just thank you.
So as they force the magnetar to collapse and the system overloads, Bender somehow reboots back in the real world and reveals that the professor can simply underclock the computer, leading it to run the simulation so slowly that the magnetar won't collapse for centuries, leading to the absolutely beautiful final sequence as the simulation glitches out and Fry and Leela slowly move to embrace each other. Okay, I know that was a lot of recap for the last few paragraphs, but this is all important for some major analysis here. There are two things I really want to talk about with this episode. One about the lore of the show that is subtly hinted at here, and another about the metatextual meaning behind this episode. And both are really cool in my opinion. Without flat out revealing it, this episode is heavily implying that the Futurama crew we follow also live in a simulation, and it's all hinted at through Bender. The professor tells Bender that his trip into the simulation will be a one-way trip. There's no way for him to return. And yet, without explanation, Bender returns. But he doesn't actually. What's happening when Bender reawakens is that the Bender from the next universe up is going into this simulation, just like our Bender went into that simulation. He reboots and awakens the exact same way in both instances.
Where am I?
Rebooting.
Where am I?
In both cases, Bender asks where he is because he's jumped into a simulation he doesn't belong to, so listen carefully to what he says when he shows back up in our universe.
Oh, I had to come tell you something.
Bender is sad and wistful, not like when we last saw him inside the simulation, where he had accepted his fate and the fact that he isn't real. Like our Bender wanted to tell the simulated crew that they weren't real, this Bender came to this simulation to tell them something as well. There's no explanation for how Bender came back or how he knew how to save the simulation. It's because he's a different Bender from the next universe or next simulation up.
It's Bender's all the way down.
This idea might make some fans mad, since now the Bender we've been following is stuck in the underclocked simulation, and now we've got a different Bender, but I think the science fiction of it all makes it worth it, much like the results of the late Philip J. Fry's universe jumping. But what I want to talk about even more than this subtle Futurama lore bomb is the metatextual takeaway from this episode, or at least my metatextual takeaway. To me, it's sort of about the show Futurama itself. The way I see it, Bender's adoration and connection to the simulation of the universe is a stand-in for us as an audience and our love for Futurama. Bender has grown this immense connection to these simulated people and cannot cope with the idea of their existence coming to an end. A concept that Futurama fans are all too familiar with. We love and adore these fictional characters because even though they aren't real, there's beauty in their stories that we connect to. And I think the dialogue throughout the episode really reflect this idea.
Would it be any less beautiful if it weren't real? And we weren't real?
They, of course, aren't real. We know this, but they still have a real impact on us.
We're nothing more than atoms, right? But somehow, we are more.
And this even extends to when we dislike an episode of the show. The fact is that we care so much about this show and these fictional characters that we truly feel disappointment if the show lets us down. These moving drawings have a real, tangible effect on us, positive and negative, and that is special. Obviously, this isn't unique to Futurama, it's fiction in general, but in a way, this show is a simulation. Obviously, it's not a literal simulation, but it is an entirely fabricated world and universe. And while this latest revival wasn't necessarily one any of us expected, in the past, Futurama has been canceled prematurely, and there have been times where we as fans were all Bender in this episode, desperate for the simulation that we connected to continue its life, hoping that it doesn't end tragically. And obviously, beyond that, there's the existential message of it all. Bender is a character in particular who is constantly searching for the meaning in his existence, which has always worked great given that he's an artificial being. But this is obviously something that humans do in general, whether that's seeking answers through religion or science or philosophy. And if the answer is actually that, oh, we are literally all just in a giant simulation, ultimately, does that matter? It doesn't change anything from our perspective, because existence isn't about the answer, it's about the meaning we find within it. The answer probably isn't going to bring you peace. The connections we make are what are important to us, whether we're real or we're simulated.
But I love you, now and forever. And that much is real, even if we're not.
The more I watch this finale, the more I really, really love it. So many of Futurama's best episodes balance mind-bending sci-fi premises with impressive existential and philosophical themes, and this one really nails both. I'm not sure if it's my #1 favorite of this newest season. It might sit just behind I Know What You Did Next Xmas, but who knows, this one keeps getting better for me, so it could overtake it. This first Hulu season of Futurama definitely had its ups and downs. Going in, I was not convinced it should happen at all, and while I do still think Meanwhile was a beautiful ending for the show, we've gotten some stuff this season that I'm really grateful for. And after a 10-year hiatus, I feel like the writers can really start hitting their stride in the next 10 episodes. I would talk a little bit more about the season as a whole, but I think I'm going to put together a big compilation of all of these breakdowns I did for the season and close that out with my more complete thoughts about the 10-episode run. Until then, I've had an incredible time discussing New Futurama for the first time since 2013, and I hope y'all did too, no matter how you felt about these episodes. I, of course, also want to hear what you have to say about this episode as well. Did you love it as much as I did? Are you convinced we live in a simulation now? Let me know below in the comments, and thanks for following me on this Futurama journey. Peace.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.